Imagine you're a 6-year-old boy and you see your mom wearing things like lipstick and nail polish, and you think it's pretty, so you ask to wear some too. In response, your parents get really angry and they yell at you, making you cry. So they tell you to man up and that you shouldn't want to do such girly things. How would you feel after being told off for wanting to have fun? Would you feel angry, frustrated, sad? Such is the case for many boys everywhere who are faced with toxic masculinity. Today, I will be advocating for people to teach their young relatives that the way that they express themselves, both creatively and emotionally, has nothing to do with their validity as boys or with any gender identity in general. Addressing these negative concepts of men and boys' behavior is essential because toxic masculinity is often the root of gendered violence. Seeing as how I wrote my previous informational speech on femicide, which is the murder of women as a manifestation of gendered violence, I have more context on the subject and how someone might reduce its high numbers of gendered violence than the average person. First, I will be discussing toxic masculinity and gendered violence in further detail. Then I will be discussing how they relate to each other. And lastly, I will be showing you some prevention strategies that I want you to implement with your younger relatives. To start, in order to explain the relationship between gendered violence and toxic masculinity, I will define them and give you some more context. UN Women is a United Nations entity that works for the empowerment of women around the world. They define gender-based violence as harmful acts directed to an individual or a group of individuals based on their gender. And this definition can include any violence committed based on or as a result of gender relations. Still, it is mainly used to refer to any sort of power differential that puts girls and women at risk for multiple kinds of violence. As I mentioned before, femicide is considered to be gender-based violence because it happens when a girl or a woman is killed, usually by a man, solely because they are a girl or a woman. As for toxic masculinity, it is used to refer to cultural norms such as gender norms that turn men against themselves. An article written by Maya Salam in the New York Times in 2019 mentions that the term toxic masculinity originated in women's studies classrooms, however, recently has been used to identify anything that belittles someone for not being manly enough. And this includes aspects of homophobia, greed, and other things such as that are characteristic of hypermasculinity. So an example of this harmful masculinity is believing that crying is girly or that being nice to someone makes you gay. The notion that letting your feelings out or that being respectful makes you any less of a man is harmful because it leads to a buildup of stress and emotions that can come out negatively. An example involving creative expression would be like telling boys that playing with dolls or playing house is for girls. Not only does this limit the child's creativity because it limits child's creativity, also leading to the same buildup of stress and negative emotions, but it also just makes no sense in general because it implies that boys don't and can't grow up to become fathers or to have families themselves. Moving on to my second point, knowing about toxic masculinity is important because violence stems from the relationship between genders. To expand upon this idea, I'll refer back to the previous example of teaching boys to hold back their emotions. The American Psychology Association, also known as APA, is a professional organization that represents psychologists in the United States. They published an article in a newsletter titled Harmful Masculinity and Violence, in which they state that the restriction of emotional expression and the pressure to conform to expectations of dominance and aggression may heighten the potential of boys to engage in general acts of violence, and this violence can include anything from bullying, harassment, or physical aggression. To clarify, this means that when boys are emasculated for being human and letting their emotions out, they feel the need to prove themselves by resorting to drastic extremes of the masculine ideal. In connection to violence against women, the World Health Organization, which is a special agency that works with public health around the world, released data in 2018 in a book called Violence Against Women Prevalence Estimates that showed that an estimated number of 736 million women, the equivalent to 30% of women aged 15 and up, have experienced either intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence. or both at least once in their lives. In this case, intimate partner violence refers to any aggression that comes from your partner or someone you're in a relationship with, and then um, non-intimate or non-partner sexual violence refers to any aggression that comes from a stranger or someone who is not your partner. To put these numbers into perspective, 736 million women aged 15 and older is equivalent to 1 in 3 women, meaning that this violence is very prevalent and it can happen to anyone. I have 2 sisters, meaning that any one of us 3 could be the 1 in 3 that gets affected by this gender violence, and that is very scary. Now that I have shown how restricting male expression with toxic masculinity relates to gender violence, I'll be discussing some prevention strategies that I want you to implement with any young boys in your life or any children that look up to you in general. Referring back to the APA newsletter from earlier, they say that that one way to reduce harmful masculinity is to promote healthy relationship skills that turn teens' acceptance away from traditional norms and dating violence. So one way to do this would be to teach them about consent. And consent means it happens when 2 parties mutually agree to do something, whether this is anything from kissing to hugging, as long as both agree, everything is okay. And this would help because it would stop promoting the idea that a man in a relationship with a woman should hold all the power and all dominance in order to prove that he is the man in the relationship. A second thing that they recommend is to identify and treat psychological distress that comes with social norms. So there are multiple ways of doing this. One of those ways is to talk to a therapist, or if you're a parent, to promote, to ensure that your child's mental health is stable. However, if neither of these are viable for you or don't apply to you, all you have to do is be a friendly shoulder to lean on. And if someone comes to you to discuss issues that they have encountered with upholding certain social expectations, you can comfort them by telling them that their feelings are natural and that talking to someone about them can be really helpful. And lastly, another way to help the situation is to take a look at your own perspective and how you may be promoting harmful masculinity yourself. Although you may not be doing it on purpose because it is likely that you also grew up with these ideas, it's important to be introspective since issues revolving around social norms can only be resolved through a collective effort in which everyone agrees to stop emasculating children and making them feel inferior for being themselves and for expressing their emotions. Today, I went over the definition of toxic masculinity and gendered violence, the relationship between the terms, as well as some prevention strategies to promote healthy self-expression, as well as reduce rates of gendered violence. Due to harmful standards that boys face into toxic masculinity, one can see that these ideals that they are forced to uphold impact not only themselves, but they can also be dangerous for those around them. Now that I have presented you with some ideas on how to improve the situation, make sure to employ them to ensure that positive experiences with self-expression and just safety in general for boys in all genders now and in the future.